On his last morning alive, Jean-Christophe Lafaille woke up as perhaps the most isolated man on Earth. Perched at 25,000 feet on a narrow ridge of Makalu, the world's fifth highest mountain, he faced a day of brutal, nearly impossible climbing. Temperatures were at minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, the summit still 3,000 feet above, with no one else on the mountain. After a brief call to his wife, he stepped out into the bitter cold, alone, then disappeared into the void, never to be seen again. You know, when you think about mountain climbing, especially on the world's highest peaks, it's easy to imagine adventure, breathtaking views, and a sense of triumph. But the truth is, the mountains can be harsh and unforgiving. Few people know this better than Jean-Christophe Lafaille, one of the most accomplished climbers in history. Jean-Christophe was born in a small town called Gap in France on March 31st, 1965. Like a lot of kids who grew up in the mountains, he developed a passion for climbing early on. As a teenager, he spent most of his time exploring the rocky cliffs around him, particularly at a place called Sousse. It's a stunning limestone cliff in the Alps, and Jean-Christophe helped turn it into one of the world's top climbing spots. He wasn't just good at climbing, he was a natural. By 1989, Jean-Christophe had already made a name for himself in the world of sport climbing. He became the first Frenchman to solo climb a route graded 7C+, which is like climbing a nearly vertical wall with almost no handholds. But that wasn't enough for him. He wanted to go higher. He wanted the biggest mountains in the world, and that's when he shifted his focus to the Alps and the Himalayas. In the early 1990s, Jean-Christophe trained as a mountain guide. This gave him the skills to tackle the tougher, higher altitude peaks. And he didn't waste any time. He made several difficult ascents in the Mont Blanc Massif, which is a huge mountain range in the Alps. One of his most famous climbs during this time was the first solo ascent of a route called Divine Providence. This is one of the hardest routes on Mont Blanc. Climbers usually do it with a partner because of how tough it is. But Jean-Christophe, he did it alone. This was just the beginning. The world's tallest mountains, those over 26,000 feet tall, called 8,000ers, started to call to him. These mountains are known for their deadly conditions, including avalanches, extreme cold, and thin air. But Jean-Christophe wasn't afraid. He climbed 11 of these monsters, often taking routes no one had ever tried before. Sometimes he did it alone, which is incredibly dangerous because if something went wrong, there'd be no one to help. And something did go wrong during one of his climbs. It was 1992, and Jean-Christophe had been invited to join Pierre Béguin, a legendary French climber, on an expedition to Annapurna. Now, Annapurna is notorious for being one of the deadliest mountains in the world. It's tall, over 26,000 feet high, and the south face is especially dangerous. The walls are steep, nearly vertical in some parts, and covered in ice and loose rock. But for elite climbers like Béguin and Lafaille, it was a challenge they wanted to take on. The plan was to climb in what's called alpine style. This means they wouldn't use fixed ropes, campsites stocked with supplies, or Sherpas to help carry gear. Instead, it would just be the two of them, carrying everything they needed as they climbed, relying on each other and their own skills. This style of climbing is riskier because there's no safety net, no backup plan if things go wrong. By October of that year, after the monsoon season had passed, Béguin and Lafaille started their climb up the south face of Annapurna. They made great progress at first, despite the thin air and bitter cold at that altitude. Soon they were more than 24,000 feet up, closing in on the summit. But then the weather took a turn for the worse. Thick clouds rolled in, bringing snow and wind. The conditions became so dangerous that the two climbers decided to turn back. They'd have to abandon their summit attempt for now and try again another time. The descent, however, would turn out to be even more dangerous than the climb up. Because of their lightweight alpine-style approach, they didn't have much protective gear to set up solid anchors for abseiling down the mountain. Abseiling is when you lower yourself down a rope, which is usually anchored to something sturdy like a rock or an ice screw. But on this steep, icy face, they had to make do with what they had. Sometimes, they used just a single piece of equipment, like a cam, which is a small metal device that wedges into cracks in the rock. On one of their abseils, Pierre Béguin was leading the way down when disaster struck. He was relying on a single cam to hold his weight, but the rock gave way and the cam dislodged. In an instant, Béguin fell. He had been carrying most of their technical equipment, including their remaining ropes. Jean-Christophe watched helplessly as his partner tumbled down the face and disappeared. It was every climber's worst nightmare. Now, Jean-Christophe was alone, almost a vertical mile above safety, with hardly any equipment left. He had no choice but to try and make it down by himself. The face of Annapurna was steep, around 75 degrees in some places, and the weather was still terrible. But Lafaille didn't give up. He carefully down-climbed, picking his way down to their last bivouac site, a spot where they'd camped earlier. There, he found 60 feet of thin rope, which he could use to make short abseils down some of the toughest sections. Even with this bit of rope, Jean-Christophe's situation was dire. Without proper anchors, he had to improvise. At one point, he trusted his life to a few tent pegs driven into the rock. Another time, he used a plastic bottle as his anchor. It sounds unbelievable, but that's how desperate the situation was. He had to trust these makeshift solutions because there was no other option. Eventually, he made it down to what he thought would be a safer part of the mountain, a section where they had installed a fixed rope on a steep rock band earlier in the climb. But just as he reached this spot, he was hit by a falling rock. The rock struck his right arm, breaking it. Now, he was injured, alone, and still high up on one of the world's deadliest mountains. Jean-Christophe found a ledge to rest on, but he was unable to move. With his broken arm and no rope left, he lay there, hoping someone would come to his rescue. A Slovenian team was climbing on another part of the mountain, and Jean-Christophe could see them in the distance. But after considering the dangerous conditions, the team decided it was too risky to attempt a rescue. They left him there, alone on the mountain. Jean-Christophe could see the valley below, full of life. At night, he could even see the flashes of trekkers' cameras far below. It must have been torture to know that life was continuing on, so close and yet completely out of reach. After 2 days of waiting for help that never came, Jean-Christophe realized he had to keep going. No one was coming to save him. He tried to continue abseiling down, but with only one arm, it was nearly impossible to control the rope. So, he resorted to down climbing, slowly and carefully inching his way down the mountain, using just his feet and one good hand. Finally, after days of suffering, Jean-Christophe made it to the Slovenian team's base camp. The climbers there were shocked. They had assumed he was dead and had already sent word to his then wife, Veronique, that he had perished on the mountain. This story of his escape from Annapurna became one of the most legendary tales in mountaineering history. After that terrifying experience on Annapurna, Jean-Christophe Lafaille was done with climbing. Or at least that's what he told himself. It's hard to blame him, right? After losing his partner Pierre Béguin in such a tragic way and nearly losing his own life, who wouldn't want to walk away from the mountains? The physical toll was bad enough. His broken arm took time to heal, but the psychological scars were even deeper. The weight of Béguin's death, the close brush with his own mortality, and the loneliness he felt during those days stuck on the mountain haunted him. But the mountains have a way of calling you back. Little by little, Jean-Christophe started to return to the hills. Not the towering peaks of the Himalayas just yet, but the smaller, more manageable foothills of the Alps. At first, he wasn't doing anything too extreme, just scrambling up and down the rocks to clear his head. As time passed, Jean-Christophe's confidence grew. It wasn't long before he started taking on the most difficult climbs again. One of his most impressive feats in the Alps came when he linked together 9 of the most difficult north faces in just 15 days. He didn't just climb them, he skied from one mountain to the next. It was an extraordinary display of skill, strength, and endurance, the kind of thing only a handful of climbers in the world could even dream of doing. He also made the first ascent of a new route on the Petit Dreux, a famous peak in the Alps. It was called the Lafaille route, and at the time, it was considered the hardest route in the Alps. It was a huge accomplishment, but for Jean-Christophe, the most meaningful climbs weren't always in the Alps. His true passion was still the towering giants of the Himalayas. A year after his nightmare on Annapurna, Jean-Christophe went back to the Himalayas. This time, he successfully climbed Cho Oyu, one of the world's tallest mountains. It was like he was proving to himself that he could still do it, that he could face the mountains again and win. After that, in 1994, he tackled another Himalayan giant, Shishapangma, climbing a new route on the north face, and he did it alone. This marked the beginning of what would become a series of solo ascents on some of the world's highest and most dangerous peaks. In 1996, Jean-Christophe pulled off an incredible feat by climbing two 26,000-foot peaks, Gasherbrum 1 and Gasherbrum 2, in just 4 days. Think about that for a second. Climbing one of these mountains is a lifetime achievement for many climbers. Jean-Christophe did 2 of them in less than a week, and he did it by himself. His strength and stamina were extraordinary, but there was one mountain that Jean-Christophe couldn't quite shake: Annapurna. It was like a shadow that followed him everywhere, always in the back of his mind. He even called his autobiography Prisoner of Annapurna. He returned to the mountain 3 times after that fateful climb in 1992. The first time, he tried to solo the British line on the south face, but the snow conditions were terrible, and he had to turn back. The second time, in 1998, he went with a larger team, but the expedition ended in tragedy when one of the climbers was killed in an avalanche. Annapurna seemed cursed, but Jean-Christophe wasn't ready to give up on it just yet. Finally, in 2002, 10 years after the accident that almost ended his life, Jean-Christophe reached the summit of Annapurna. He climbed the mountain via the long and difficult East Ridge, alongside a fellow climber named Alberto Inurrategui. It was a huge personal victory for Jean-Christophe, a moment of redemption that helped him come to terms with everything that had happened on that mountain a decade earlier. By 2003, Jean-Christophe had set a new goal for himself: to climb all 14 of the world's tallest mountains, those over 26,000 feet. But unlike many climbers who go after this goal, Jean-Christophe wasn't interested in just ticking off the peaks on a list. He wanted to do it his way, by forging new routes, climbing alone when he could, and taking on the more dangerous challenges that other climbers avoided. That year, he made remarkable progress, summiting Nanga Parbat, Dhaulagiri, solo, and Broad Peak in just 2 months. However, his ascent of Broad Peak nearly cost him his life when he fell into a crevasse. To make matters worse, he developed high-altitude pulmonary edema, a buildup of fluid in the lungs that can be fatal at those heights. Fortunately, he was rescued by fellow climbers Ed Viesturs and Denis Urubko. Despite the close call, Jean-Christophe kept pushing forward. When asked why he preferred to climb solo, his wife, Katia, explained that he couldn't bear the thought of losing another partner in the mountains. It was safer for his heart, even if it wasn't physically safer. In December 2004, Jean-Christophe made another solo ascent, this time on Shishapangma. He was attempting to make the first winter ascent of the mountain, but he reached the summit on December 11th, just before winter officially began. So, while it was an incredible feat, it didn't count as a true winter ascent in the eyes of many climbers. Still, by this point, Jean-Christophe had conquered 11 of the 14 8,000ers, with only Everest, Kanchenjunga, and Makalu remaining. In December of 2005, he set off on a solo attempt to climb Makalu, the 5th highest mountain in the world, standing over 27,000 feet tall. What made this climb so dangerous wasn't just the height, it was the time of year. No one had ever successfully climbed Makalu in the winter. In fact, many considered the idea downright suicidal. The fierce winter winds and deadly cold of the Himalayas had kept climbers at bay for decades. But for Jean-Christophe, that danger was part of the appeal. He once said, "I find it fascinating that our planet still has areas where no modern technology can save you, where you are reduced to your most basic and essential self." He knew the risks, but saw them as part of a deeper connection to nature. He spent 4 weeks on the mountain between December and January, entirely alone above his advanced base camp at 17,400 feet. Every step, every task had to be done by him alone. There were no Sherpas to help carry loads or set up tents. The weather was brutal. Strong winds would batter him, even throwing him into the air at one point, destroying his tent and forcing him to retreat from a high pass on the mountain known as the Makalu Law. But Jean-Christophe didn't give up. He waited for the weather to improve, hunkering down at base camp for 2 weeks. Then, on January 24th, the weather finally cleared and Jean-Christophe made his move. He set off up the mountain again, communicating with his wife, Katia, several times a day through a satellite phone. He was in good spirits, determined to reach the summit. By the morning of January 27th, he was camped on a small ledge about 3,000 feet below the summit. The climb had been grueling, but Jean-Christophe felt strong. He called Katia and told her that he was going to make a push for the top that day. But after that call, no one ever heard from Jean-Christophe Lafaille again. For days, Katia waited by the phone, hoping for some sign of life. But it never came. She wasn't the only one worried. Back at base camp, his support team anxiously waited for his return. The reality soon set in that Jean-Christophe was missing, alone somewhere on Makalu in the middle of winter. Given how high up he was and the freezing temperatures, there was no possibility of sending a rescue team after him. No one in the world was acclimatized enough to reach his high camp, and the risk of sending someone into that brutal environment was too great. The only thing anyone could do was wait. A week went by, and still, there was no word. His team gave up hope of finding him alive. Eventually, a helicopter flew to search for him, but they couldn't find any trace of Jean-Christophe, not even a clue as to what had happened. It was as if he had simply vanished into the mountain. His body has never been found, and to this day, no one knows exactly what went wrong during that final climb. Perhaps he was caught in an avalanche, or maybe the brutal cold finally got to him. Whatever the case, Makalu became his final resting place. Jean-Christophe left behind his wife, Katia, and 3 children. 2 were from a previous marriage, and 1, Tom, was his son with Katia. His disappearance was a heartbreaking loss for his family and for the climbing world. Even though he was gone, Jean-Christophe's legacy as one of the greatest mountaineers in history lived on. His daring solo climbs and his resilience in the face of death were legendary. He wasn't afraid to push the limits of what seemed possible, and in doing so, he inspired countless climbers to follow their own dreams, no matter how dangerous they might be. This inspiration clearly lived on in his son, Tom Lafaille, who has become an alpinist and ski mountaineer himself. Tom has returned to his father's roots in the Himalayas and, in 2023, made the first successful French ski descent from Broad Peak. Even though he disappeared on Makalu, his spirit remains in every climber who dares to challenge the mountains, embracing both their beauty and their danger, just as he did.